The fire was already swallowing the house. Her screams could not reach inside. But the dog was already running. Max did not bark. He never did not unless it was important. And tonight, it was. The fire began in the kitchen just after 7:00. Ruth Whittaker had stepped out for a moment to toss potato peels into the compost bin behind the shed. The evening air was thick with the scent of lilacs and lawn clippings, and her knees ached the way they always did after a humid hour day. She did not hear the smoke alarm. She saw the smoke before anything else curling from the corner of the rookit. Light did not belong there. Ellie. Her heart clenched. She dropped the bowl. It shattered on the back step, but Ruth did not notice. She was already running barefoot across the dry grass, screaming her granddaughter's name. Ellie, Ellie, baby, where are you? Flames licked through the living room window. Curtains flared up like they would been soaked in oil. Glass popped and cracked. Black smoke bloomed into the night like thunderclouds. Ruth tried to get in. The front door was hot to the touch. She grabbed the garden hose, spraying blindly, but the fire had already claimed the inside. She pounded on the siding. Please, God. No, Ellie. Then she remembered Max. The dog was there. He had been there. He always was. Ruth spun, searching the yard, but the old German shepherd was gone. There was no answer. And then through the smoke, through the shrill wail of approaching sirens, Ruth saw him. A blur of fur and muscle launched up onto the porch, paws scrabbling at the scorched wood. His ears were flat. His eyes were fixed. Max barreled through the broken front window, vanishing into the inferno. Ruth screamed, falling to her knees. Neighbors were running toward the fence now, their faces pale in the flickering light. Call 911. The girl's still in there. Someone yelled. Ruth did not move. She could not. Her whole body shook shock, terror, disbelief. Max had gone into the fire. They would lived in that house for 6 years. Ruth had moved back to Story City, hour after her daughter's funeral. Too many memories in Des Moines, too many questions no one dared ask. She bought a little ranch-style place on Clover Drive, a faded yellow house with a leaning mailbox and a bird bath full of marbles. It was supposed to be temporary. But then Ellie stopped speaking, not in anger, not in fear. She just went quiet. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. Therapists gave Ruth worksheets and hope wrapped in clinical terms. Nothing changed. Ellie colored pictures in silence and slept with the lights on. And then, one Tuesday in late September, Ruth brought Max home. The dog had been retired from the Des Moines International Airport, K-Unit. He was 11 years old and carried himself with the wariness of a soldier between wars. No one else wanted him. Too old. They said. Too serious. But Ruth knew better. She would watched her husband of Vietnam vet carry that same quiet gravity. Max looked at her with the same eyes. So she brought him home. And Ellie, for the first time in months. She smiled. Didn't he say anything? But smiled. Now Ruth sat in the dirt, gripping a garden hose that no longer worked. Her eyes locked on the burning house. Her voice was gone from screaming. Her knees bled from crawling. The world had narrowed to one point. Where was Max? Where was Ellie? Sirens wailed. Firemen leapt from trucks like angels in helmets. Water roared. Axes flashed. Lights pulsed red and white across the lawn, illuminating Ruth's pale, hollow face. She would not move, not until someone told her, not until she knew. And then a shape at the edge of the smoke, low to the ground, moving slow, limping. He came out through the side gate, muzzle charred, fur blackened, one eye closed from soot. In his mouth, gently, was the sleeve of a pale pink hoodie. The sleeve was attached to a child. Ellie. Ruth ran. She did not feel her legs move, just remembered the ground rising to meet her, and the smoke stinging her lungs. Max laid Ellie down on the grass with the gentleness of 1,000 years. The girl coughed, her tiny body trembling, and rolled onto her side. Ruth gathered her into her arms and wept loud, broken sobs that came from a place no one could reach. Max at me, panting heavily. His paws were raw, his breathing shallow, but he did not whimper. He simply watched as Ruth held Ellie close, brushing soot from her cheeks, kissing her forehead again and again, watched as the firefighters checked for burns, for smoke inhalation, watched as the crowd began to cheer, and then he lay down. His head rested on Ruth's foot. His body, so brave, so old, so tired, finally gave into stillness. Later, when the ambulance had come and gone, and the fire had been brought under control, Ruth sat beside Max in the back of her neighbor's pickup truck. Ellie curled beside her, wrapped in a blanket. Neither spoke. The world was too full, too broken and too holy all at once. Ruth reached for Max's ear, stroking the sin tips gently. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved us both. Blinked once." The moon hung low over the trees, casting silver light on the ruins of the house. Crickets chirped in the wet grass. Somewhere far away, a train moaned its lonely way through the night. And then, a sound Ruth never thought she would hear. A voice. Small. Shaky. One word. Ruth froze. She looked down at Ellie, at the wide, tear-bright eyes and trembling lips. The girl said again, barely louder than breath. Ruth began to cry again. Only this time, they were tears of something else. A new beginning, a word reclaimed from silence, a prayer in the shape of a name. Part 2. The Dog Who Stayed. Ruth sat on the porch swing of her neighbor's house. A thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders. It was nearly 3 a.m. The fire trucks were gone. The reporters had packed up their gear. Even the cicadas had grown quiet. Only the swing creaked, and Max lay curled at her feet. His chest rose slowly, one breath at a time. A patch of fur was missing from his shoulder. His right front paw had been wrapped by the empt with gauze and tape. The smell of smoke still clung to his coat. But he was alive, and so was Ellie. The girl was asleep inside, wrapped in a comforter on the neighbor's couch. Ruth had stayed outside. She did not trust her legs to carry her much farther. The swing rocked gently, and she remembered Max had not always been Max. He was born in a litter of 5 at a canine training facility just outside Topeka, Kansas. His original name was Thur. He would been the strongest pup, the one with the wide shoulders and fierce focus. By 8 weeks, He could follow scent trails better than dogs twice his age. He was trained to detect explosives. By the time he was 3, he had already served 2 tours on military bases overseas. Then came the airport detail back home. He became a quiet hero, finding a pipe bomb tucked inside a duffel bag in Terminal C. No lives lost. No headlines. Just a silent report and a new scar above his eye. Ruth learned all this from a yellowed folder the adoption agency had given her. She had not meant to take a dog that day. She had gone in looking for a cat. Ellie was 6 then, just 2 months into her silence. The house had grown still. Too still. Ruth thought maybe a kitten would bring some life back. But when they walked past the older dog's row, Ellie stopped. Stopped cold in front of a caged Max 11 News retired service dog. He had not moved, just lifted his head, eyes level, and stared at Ellie like he knew her, like he had been waiting. And Ellie, without a word, reached her hand through the bars and laid it against his nose. The shelter staff had gasped. He does not usually let anyone, but he did. He let Ellie touch him. And when they opened the gate, he followed her like he would always belonged. So Ruth signed the papers. She changed his name from Thor to Max, because it sounded softer, because Ellie smiled when she heard it. The swing creaked again. Ruth wiped her nose on the corner of the blanket. She remembered how the first few weeks had gone. Max had picked a spot beneath Ellie's window to sleep at night. Every morning, when Ruth opened the bedroom door, she would find him lying right there, like a sentinel. Ellie still would not speak, but she began to draw again. She filled a notebook with pictures of Max, sometimes wearing a superhero cape, sometimes flying through the sky. One drawing showed Max standing between her and a dark shadow. Ruth kept that one taped to the fridge. Sometimes Ellie would point to it and smile. Max became more than a pet. He was Ellie's anchor, and Ruth's too, in ways she did not admit. She would buried her daughter with a rose carved into the headstone, and no answers in her heart. There were nights Ruth had stood in the laundry room, gripping the edges of the dryer, wondering if she could do this, raise a broken child at 52, alone. But Max would nudge open the door and sit beside her. He would not lick. Wouldn't tea wine. Just sit. And somehow, that was enough. The stars began to fade in the east. Dawn was coming. Ruth leaned down and touched Max's head gently. You brought her out. His eyes fluttered. He blinked once. Slow. Steady. You saved her life. Ruth whispered. A breeze moved across the lawn. Somewhere down the street, a rooster called. Ruth thought of her husband, then Tone. A welder, a tall man who always carried a handkerchief and hated microwaves. He would love dogs. Had a golden retriever named Skip when they first married. Buried him in the backyard with his fishing pole and a packet of beef jerky. Tone Woodvie loved Max. Woodvie said the dog had soul. Inside the house, Ellie stirred. Ruth heard the soft creak of couch springs. A moment later, the door opened slowly. The girl stood in the doorway, wrapped in the neighbor's plaid blanket, her bare feet quiet against the boards. She did not say anything. She just walked to Max and knelt beside him. She stroked his ear. Max opened one eye and thumped his tail. Once, Ellie looked up at Ruth. Her lips pressed together. her eyes still full of sleep and smoke and something Ruth could not name. Then the girl whispered something. It was too quiet to catch. What, baby? Ellie leaned closer to Max and said it again. Good boy. 2 words. Too perfect. Broken words. Ruth covered her mouth. She did not cry, not right away. She just let the silence wrap around them like another blanket, let the dawn pour over their backs, and let the weight of the night begin to lift. Later that morning, they took Max to Henley's clinic out by Route 30. He would lost some fur, burned his paw pads, inhaled smoke. But the vet smiled and said, he is too stubborn to go just yet. They left with antibiotics, bandages, and a bag of liver treats. Max rode in the front seat. Ruth and Ellie shared the back. Ellie kept one hand on Max's shoulder the whole way home. Well, not home. The house on Clover Drive was gone. But the neighbor offered her guest room, for as long as they needed. A church down the road promised help. Someone started a fundraiser online. And Ruth. She felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not loud. Not shiny. But steady, like an old dog refusing to quit. Part 3. The house that wasn't there. 2 days later, Ruth stood on the blackened lawn where her house used to be. The fire marshal had given her permission to visit the site, no longer hazardous. He said, though the word felt too technical for a place that had once held birthday cakes and bedtime stories. All that remained was a warped skeleton. Charred beams jutted into the sky like broken ribs. The front steps had collapsed inward. The porch swing, the one where Tom had spent summer evenings sipping iced tea, was just a heap of metal and ash. Ellie stood beside her, small and still. She held Max's leash in both hands. Even though the dog was too weak to pull, he limped beside her, bandaged paws pressing softly into the soot-dusted grass. Ruth knelt down and touched the earth. It was warm. Not from the sun. Just still warm. Like the house had only just exhaled its last breath. The news crew came the day after. A young woman with perfect makeup and a trembling voice asked Ruth how it felt to lose everything. Ruth did not answer. She looked at Max instead. He did not let us lose everything, she said softly. One hand on the dog's head. The camera lingered on Max, on Ellie, on Ruth's eyes. And the next morning, something strange happened. Ruth's mailbox at the neighbor's house was full. Cards, letters, checks, a pair of little pink sneakers from a retired teacher in Wisconsin. People wrote things like, "Your story reminded me of my father's beagle, who pulled him out of a burning barn in 1943. My granddaughter has not spoken in 2 years. We showed her the video of Ellie. She smiled." Or simply, "Thank you for reminding us." Ruth sat on the neighbor's porch, reading each letter aloud. Ellie sat beside her, silent but listening. Max lay at their feet, tail flicking every time Ruth said his name. One morning, just after sunrise, Ellie walked up to Ruth holding something in her hands. It was a photograph, half burned. Ruth took it, gently. She recognized the picture instantly. Tom, in his welding coveralls, standing behind the grill in their backyard, flipping burgers while Ellie played with sidewalk chalk. She thought it was gone, but Ellie had found it, dug it out of the ashes with her tiny fingers. Ruth sat down hard on the porch steps and cried. The kind of cry that does not wrench or sob, just flows. Ellie reached over and laid her hand on her grandmother's back. A quiet reminder. They still had this. They still had each other. That afternoon, they drove to a thrift store in Boone to look for clothes. Ruth did not own much anymore, just what neighbors had brought over. A few church dresses, an oversized cardigan, a coat that smelled like mothballs and roses. Ellie picked out a red hoodie with a dog embroidered on the sleeve. She did not speak, but her eyes said enough. Max stayed in the car. Too many stairs, too many loud voices. When they came back, Ellie sat with him in the back seat. Ruth glanced through the rearview mirror and saw the girl whispering something. Couldn't he hear what? Didn't he need to? Max's tale told her it was something good. On the 1-week anniversary of the fire, Ruth took Ellie to what was left of the front yard. They planted sunflowers. Tom had loved sunflowers. Said they looked like they were always listening to the sky. Ruth cleared a patch of dirt with a trowel. Ellie knelt beside her, patting the soil with bare hands. Max and me, watching. Behind them, the neighbor's house still had their names taped to the mailbox. Whitaker and E. It was temporary, but it was something. The fundraiser had raised over $14,000. A local builder came by and offered to help draw up plans. Someone from the mayor's office asked if they would be willing to appear at a town council meeting. Ruth politely declined. All she wanted was one good roof, room with a bed, a place to make grilled cheese sandwiches, a patch of grass for Max to lie in. Everything else could wait. That night, Ellie came into Ruth's room carrying her drawing pad. She climbed up beside her grandmother and opened to a fresh page. It was a sketch. Not a house, not exactly, but a tree. Under the tree sat Ruth, reading a book. Max lay beneath her feet. And Ellie. She stood beside them, holding a watering can. Above the drawing, in shaky block letters, were 4 words. The house we remember. Ruth swallowed hard. You want to build it like this? She whispered. Ellie nodded. Then paused. Her lips parted. A beat passed, and she whispered. Barely audible. Please. 1 word. 1 fragile word. But Ruth heard it like a hymn. She held Ellie close, buried her face in her hair, and whispered, We will. Max was not getting younger. He had good days and bad. Some mornings, he moved slow, his back legs stiff, his breathing shallow. Other days, he followed Ellie across the yard with a tennis ball in his mouth, wagging like he had a secret. Henley warned Ruth gently. He is past 12 now. Every day is a gift. Ruth knew that. She could see it in his eyes. But Max did not seem to care about years. He cared about the moment, the soft soil under his paws, the hand on his head, the girl's laugh even if it was quiet. One evening, just after supper, Ruth found Ellie on the porch swing holding a storybook. She was not reading aloud. Not yet. But her lips were moving. Max lay beside her, eyes half closed. Ellie leaned down and kissed his forehead. Then she whispered, Good boy. and Max wagged his tail without opening his eyes. That was enough. For him, for her, for Ruth, who stood behind the screen door watching with her heart full and her knees aching. Because even though the house was gone, even though ashes still clung to her shoes, there, on that borrowed porch, under the fading orange light, they had everything they needed. For now. Part 4. The first brick. The new house began with a shoebox. Not wood. Concrete. Just cardboard, markers, and tape. Ellie built it on the kitchen table of the neighbor's house. She spent hours folding paper, cutting out windows, drawing trees around it. She placed a tiny black dot near the back door. That is Max, she whispered. Ruth smiled. They were waiting on permits, insurance calls, all the slow-moving things adults needed to do. But Ellie, she did not wait. She started building. From memory, from hope, from the ashes. Ruth kept a yellow legal pad beside her coffee mug, scribbling notes between sips. Call buildery. Siding. Ask Linda about leftover porch railing. Need estimate on fence posts. Each list ended the same. Max. Meds. Vet. Soft treats. He was slowing down. Sleeping more. Some nights he whimpered in his sleep soft, stuttering sounds like he was back sniffing out danger in an airport hangar. Ruth would wake, climb out of bed, and sit beside him until his breathing calmed. He would open one eye, look at her, then back to sleep, like he trusted her to keep watch. On a warm Tuesday morning, the builder arrived with his crew. Morning, Miss Whitaker, he said, tipping his hat. You sure you want to keep the footprint this small? Ruth looked over the lot. Ashes were gone. The sunflowers had bloomed around the edge. She nodded. I do not need more than what we had, she said. Just stronger this time. The builder grinned. We can do that. He patted Max on the head before heading back to his truck. Bet he will guard this place better than any alarm. Max did not respond, but his tail thumped once, as if to say, You are damn right I will. Ellie brought her shoebox house to the worksite every afternoon. She would sit on an overturned paint bucket, sketching the workers as they raised beams and nailed frames. One by she added them to her drawing. Ruth watched from the porch, a mug of sweet tea in hand. She is coming back, the neighbor said beside her. I can see it in her eyes. Ruth nodded, but she knew. It was not just Ellie who was healing. It was her. Back when Ruth was 27, her husband Tom built their first home with his own 2 hands. No contractors. Just lumber, sweat, and second-hand blueprints. They would moved in on the 4th of July, grilled hot dogs in the yard, lit sparklers at night. Tom carved their initials into the porch railing. R+T83. She remembered the way he held her hand on that first night, calloused fingers, soot under his nails, and eyes that promised forever. As the workers poured concrete, Ruth placed one small token beneath the front step, a bottle cap from a root beer Tom had loved. It was not much, but it was something. A reminder. This house was for both of them. All three of them. 4. Really? Because Max belonged here too. That weekend, Ellie surprised Ruth. She stood in the center of the new frame still, just beams and plywood, and pointed. Here, she said, voice off but steady. Max's corner. Ruth blinked. You want him to have his own space? Ellie nodded. She held up a wrinkled blueprint she would drawn in crayon. It showed a small nook near the living room, with a big cushion and a lamp beside it, a reading corner. Ellie smiled and whispered, for all of us. Ruth knelt and pulled her into a hug. Max wandered over and settled beside them. Just like always. The dog's health dipped again a few days later. He stopped eating his breakfast, slept through most of the morning. Henley came by the site personally, listened, prodded, gave Ruth that quiet, practiced look. He has got heart, the vet said, but he is tired. Ruth nodded. She already knew. That night, she sat beside Max on a folded quilt. Ellie curled up on the other side, whispering stories from her picture book. She did not read out loud, not all the words, not yet, but she traced each page with her finger, and when she pointed to the dog in the illustration, she looked at Max and said clearly, hero, then kissed his head. On the day the first brick was laid, the whole town came, not because Ruth asked. They just did. Talbot from the hardware store brought sandwiches. The librarian dropped off a stack of books for Ellie. 3 teenage boys showed up with shovels and smiles, ready to work. Max sat beneath the new front step, watching it all. When the mayor arrived with a local photographer, Ellie clung to Ruth's leg. The flash made her flinch, so Ruth pulled out her Polaroid. Old, faded, but still working. She took a single picture. Ellie, a rising frame behind them. She taped it to the inside of the shoebox house that night. Right above the tiny paper door, the walls went up. Insulation, wires, plumbing. Ellie chose a butter yellow paint for the kitchen. Ruth picked forest green for the porch swing. They added a wind chime made from old spoons and buttons, Ellie's idea. Each time it rang, Ruth smiled. Tom would be loved that, she whispered. Ellie nodded, and Ruth swore. For a second, she heard the chime say, me too. Max did not climb the steps much anymore. They built a ramp. Ruth laid down rubber mats so his paws would not slip. Ellie added hand-painted signs around the yard. Max's garden. Quiet zone. Story spot. On the last day of construction, as the last nail was driven in, Ruth walked into the new house holding a tiny tin box. Inside it, the burned photograph, the root beer cap, and the first drawing Ellie ever made of Max. She tucked it into the corner behind the bookshelf. A time capsule for the house that came after the fire, the house that love rebuilt. That night, under the stars, Ruth sat on the new porch swing. Ellie curled beside her, Max at their feet. The wind picked up, the spoons chimed, and for the first time since the fire, Ruth let herself believe they were home again. For good. Part 5. The storm. The thunder rolled in slow. It started with a low rumble in the west, barely more than a growl behind the clouds, and by late afternoon, the sky turned the color of an old bruise. Ruth stood at the new kitchen window, washing 2 chipped mugs. One said best grandma ever a yard sale find. The other had a faded picture of a fire truck, and the words rescue ready beneath it. Ellie had picked it out. For Max. The dog lay curled in his new nook, head on a pillow sewn from one of Ruth's sold flannel shirts. He had been sleeping most of the day, too tired to play, too stiff to rise when Ellie offered him a biscuit. But when the wind picked up sharp and sudden, his ears twitched, and he stood, slow, but alert, like something old had woken inside him. Looks like a nasty one, Ruth muttered, watching the black clouds roll over the cornfields. The house moaned softly as the gusts pushed against it. She closed the windows, latched the screen door, and pulled the flashlight from the drawer. Ellie stood in the hallway, holding her sketchbook. She was not shaking, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the paper. Thunder cracked. Loud. Close. Max moved between Ellie and the door, instinct more than choice. Then came the flash. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Darkness. The hum of the fridge stopped. The air turned still. Ellie gasped. Ruth was at her side in an instant. "It is all right, baby," she said, kneeling down. "It is just a storm. We have seen plenty." But Ellie's eyes were wide. She remembered. The fire had started with a flash too. A spark in the kitchen, a sudden heat. Smoke. Like now. Max pressed his side against her legs. Ellie dropped to the floor and wrapped her arms around him. She did not cry. She did not scream. She just held on. The rain came hard. Sheets of it battered the new porch, hammering the tin roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Ruth lit 2 candles and set them on the table. Then she reached for the old transistor radio Tom had kept in the garage. It still worked, battery-powered and scratchy as ever. Severe weather alert in Story County, the voice said. High winds and possible hail. Residents advised to remain indoors. Ruth exhaled slow. They were indoors. They were safe. She looked at Max. He was sitting now, ears forward, breathing fast. Not panic, something else. Memory. Like the years had peeled back, and he was back on patrol again. She saw it in his body. His stillness. His readiness. When the wind rattled the back window, Ruth heard Ellie whimper. Just once. She crouched down beside them both. She said gently, "Let us go sit in the hallway. It is safer there." Ellie nodded. Together, they moved to the short corridor between the bathroom and bedrooms. Ruth brought the flashlight. Max followed on stiff legs. Ruth sat with her back against the wall. Ellie leaned against her. Max crawled beside them, head resting on the girl's knees. The storm howled outside. But inside, there was only breathing, slow, measured. 3 hearts, side by side. "Want to tell me a story?" Ruth asked, voice barely above the wind. Ellie hesitated. Then she opened her sketchbook and pointed to a picture she would drawn earlier. A lighthouse on a hill. Max stood at the edge, nose to the wind. She whispered, "He watches for the dark." Ruth blinked hard. "You think that is what he does for us?" Ellie nodded, then turned the page. Another drawing. This one of a little girl and an old woman sitting on a porch. Swing. A dog between them. No storm in that one. Just stars. An hour passed. The worst of it moved on. Rain softened. Thunder faded to murmurs. Ruth stood and peeked outside. The yard was soaked. One of the sunflowers had snapped in half, but the house still standing. No smoke. No fire. Just wet earth and peace. When she turned back, Ellie was asleep, head against Max's back. Max did not move. He watched Ruth, and Ruth watched him. Two tired guardians, keeping one another going. Later that night, with the power still out, Ruth lit a fire in the old cast-iron stove the builder had found for her. It was more for comfort than heat. Ellie sat on a blanket, feeding Max tiny bits of chicken by hand. He ate slowly, but he ate. When the wind chimes outside clinked softly again, Ruth looked up. No storm, just breeze, and stars above the clouds. She stood, stretched her back, and said, "We made it through." Max looked up. His tail tapped the floor. And Ellie, without prompting, said, "Good boy." Before bed, Ruth took the candle and walked to the shelf where the tin box sat. She opened it. Inside, the old photo, the root beer cap, Ellie's first drawing. She added one more thing, a pressed sunflower, wilted but still golden. Then she closed the lid. Outside, the world dripped and shone. The storm had passed, and something inside all three of them had grown a little stronger, a little braver, a little more whole. Part 6. What the dog knew. Max did not get up the next morning. Not when Ruth called softly from the kitchen. Not when Ellie tiptoed across the wooden floor in her red hoodie. He lay curled in his nook breathing, yes, but heavy, still, distant. Ruth knelt beside him, gently touched his ears, his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, slow and dim, like a curtain rising on its final act. "Good morning, old boy," she whispered, smiling even as her throat tightened. Max did not lift his head, but his tail thumped once. Just once. That was all. Henley came that afternoon. He did not bring his bag. Didn't he need to? He sat on the floor beside Max and rested a hand on the dog's ribs, feeling the slow, deliberate rise and fall. Then he looked up at Ruth and shook his head. "I think he is waiting," he said quietly. "For her?" Ruth nodded. She already knew. Ellie was in the yard, drawing. She sat on the porch steps with her sketchbook in her lap, a tin box of crayons beside her, tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth, like her mother used to do when she colored. Ruth stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "Max is. Maybe you could sit with him a while." Ellie looked up. Her eyes searched Ruth's face, and she understood. Children always do. Somehow. She closed her sketchbook, walked inside. No questions. Just love. Ellie climbed onto the quilt beside Max and lay down facing him. She reached out a hand and touched the spot between his eyes. He did not move. Didn't he need to? Her touch was enough. For a long time, there were no words. Only the soft creak of the wind chimes outside, and the ticking of the old walk one Tom had carved out of scrap wood back in '89. Then, slowly, Ellie whispered, "Do you remember the fire?" Max's ear twitched. "You were brave," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had been, each word wrapped in warmth, not fear. "You went in when no one else could." A tear slid down her cheek, and then she smiled. "You were never just a dog." She leaned forward, pressed her lips to his forehead, and said what she had not said to anyone, not since that day in court when they took her mother away. "I love you." 3 words, plain as bread, sharp as glass, the kind that healed and broke and healed again. Max's eyes closed, but his breathing did not stop. Not yet. Ruth came in and knelt beside them both, placing a hand on Ellie's back. She did not speak. Didn't he have to? She simply sat, and the house knew walls, new wood, new light held them all in quiet reverence, as if it was listening. Later, after Ellie drifted into a nap beside Max's body, Ruth opened the photo album from the top shelf of the bookcase. She had not touched it since the fire. Most of the pages were reprinted copies sent from friends, scanned and rescued from online backups, but a few were originals, like the one of Tom holding Ellie as a baby, laughing with his mouth wide open and his baseball cap turned backward, or the one where Max sat between them both, tongue out, one paw resting protectively on the girl's tiny socked foot. Ruth traced the image with her finger. "He always knew?" she murmured. "From the first day." She turned the page. Another photo. Max in the yard, Ellie behind him, arms around his neck, both of them watching the sunset. There was no sound in the image, but Ruth remembered the moment perfectly. Ellie had not said a word, but Max had understood everything. The next morning, Ruth awoke before dawn. She shuffled down the hallway, rubbing her hip, wincing as her joints reminded her that 60 was not young anymore. She peeked into the living room. Max was still breathing. Barely. Ellie was still curled beside him. The sunrise cracked open the sky with orange and lavender and the faintest promise of gold. Ruth brewed coffee, the scent filling the small kitchen like a blessing. She poured a splash into her mug and stepped onto the porch. A moment later, she heard it. Footsteps behind her. She turned. Ellie stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders. "He is waiting," she said. Her voice was clear. Ruth blinked. "You mean Max?" Ellie nodded. "He wants to see the sun one more time." Ruth helped her bring Max outside. It took both of them, carefully lifting him onto the old wagon Ruth had once used for garden tools. They rolled him slowly to the porch, then onto the grass where the sun was starting to warm the earth. Ellie lay beside him. Ruth sat on the swing. The air smelled like dew and lilacs. The spoons on the wind chime clinked softly. Birds stirred in the trees. Max opened his eyes. One final time. He looked at Ruth, then at Ellie. And then, just as the first full beam of sunlight touched his fur, he let no sound, no struggle, just peace. Ellie did not cry at first. She simply touched his chest, laid her head gently on his side, then whispered, "Good boy," again and again, until her voice cracked, and then she wept, and Ruth held her, and together they watched the sun rise over a yard that would never be the same again. They buried Max under the oak tree behind the house. Ruth carved a simple stone from a chunk of slate. 2009-2023. He heard her first word. Ellie placed her drawing beside the grave, a sketch of Max as a lighthouse keeper, standing tall against a dark sea. Ruth brought the tin box, opened it, added one final thing. Max's collar. It still smelled like fire, like rain, like love. Then she closed the lid, and they lowered it into the ground. That night, Ruth sat alone on the porch swing. Ellie was inside, asleep. The air was cool. The stars were out. And though the house was quiet, it did not feel empty. Because some dogs never leave. They stay in the way the wind brushes the porch, in the shadow curled beside your feet, in the space between silence and memory. They stay because they know what we do not, what we forget. That love, once given, never truly ends. It just changes shape and waits to be remembered. Part 7. Her own voice. The house was too quiet. Not silent, there were still creaks in the wood, the chirp of birds outside, the occasional hum of the fridge, but the presence was missing. That heavy, warm, watching presence. Ruth stood in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal she did not want. A pot of coffee sat untouched. The radio was off. She glanced down to where Max's bed had been. The flannel blanket was gone, the cushion tucked away in the closet. But in her mind, she still saw him, still waited for the sound of claws on the floor, still caught herself calling breakfast. Before remembering, memory was a cruel, faithful thing. Ellie was not drawing much. Instead, she followed Ruth around the house. Not clingy, just near, always within arm's reach, a shadow with soft footsteps and watchful eyes. She did not speak unless spoken to, but when she did, it came like a gift. Unwrapped, unrushed, gentle. "Can I help? Do we have sugar? Will it rain today?" Each time, Ruth smiled and gave the same answer. Of course, honey. Because it was not about sugar or rain. It was about trying, about using the voice she had buried for so long. And the longer Max had stayed, the braver she had become. Now it was Ellie's turn to stay, to speak, to grow. One afternoon, Ruth found Ellie in the backyard by the oak tree. She had a book in her lap and was whispering to the gravestone. Her hand rested on the dirt like she was waiting for it to answer. Ruth did not interrupt. She stood on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, and let the wind carry that quiet moment between them. Later that night, over mashed potatoes and peas, Ruth said gently, "I am proud of you." Ellie blinked. "For what?" "For being brave." Ellie did not answer right away. Then she looked up and said, "He helped me." She nodded. He waited. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I think he always knew you would find your voice. Just needed time." Ellie smiled soft, but real. "I think it was always there, just hiding." The next week, the school counselor called. Ellie had missed a full year, and Ruth had not pushed her to go back. But now, things were different. "Think she is ready?" the woman asked over the phone. Ruth looked toward the window. Ellie was in the yard, tying ribbons to the low branches of the oak. They fluttered in the wind like prayer flags. "I think," Ruth said slowly, "she might be." That evening, Ruth sat Ellie down with a blank notebook. "No pressure," she said, "but if you want, we can write a letter to your new teacher." Ellie stared at the paper. Her fingers tapped the pencil softly. Then, without a word, she began to write. Not just her name, but sentences. Whole thoughts. "I like books about dogs. I do not like loud noises. I am quiet, but I am listening. My dog was a hero." Ruth read the page with tears in her eyes. Ellie did not notice. She was too busy turning the page. The first day of school came on a Thursday. Ellie dressed herself. Red hoodie, jeans with stars on the knees, a green backpack Ruth had bought at the church rummage sale. Ruth packed her a sandwich, an apple, a note that said, "I love you." Max would be proud. They stood on the porch together, waiting for the bus. The morning was cool, crisp. Fall was near. Ellie did not say much, but when the bus pulled up, she turned to Ruth and whispered, "Can you wave from the porch?" Every morning, Ruth said, and she did. Ellie climbed the steps, found a seat by the window, and pressed her palm to the glass. The bus pulled away, and Ruth stood there, waving long after it had disappeared down the road. That afternoon, when Ellie returned, she did not run up the path. She walked, steady, calm. When Ruth opened the door, Ellie handed her a paper. A drawing, a classroom with kids, a dog at the desk, and a little girl reading aloud. Ruth stared at it, heart full. Then Ellie said, "I raised my hand today." "You did?" Ellie nodded. "I read the morning sentence." Ruth pulled her close, held her. Didn't he say anything for a while? Just rocked gently, as if she could imprint this moment into the walls. Later that night, they lit a candle for Max. Ellie placed it on the windowsill. She whispered, "Thank you," then turned to Ruth and added, "For waiting." Ruth wiped her eyes and said, "It was never waiting. Just loving you loud enough until you found your own sound." Ellie grinned. "I like that." They sat by the window, the flickering flame warming the glass, the wind brushing through the trees like a memory, like a dog that still circled the yard, still kept watch, still heard every word. Before bed, Ruth found Ellie writing in her notebook. What were you working on? She asked. Ellie looked up. A story. Oh, yeah. What is it called? Ellie held up the first page. In crooked block letters. It read, The Dog Who Waited for Me. Ruth swallowed the lump in her throat. Sounds like a good one. It is. Ellie said, But I am only on chapter 1. Well. Ruth smiled, brushing a curl behind the girl's ear. I think you have got a lot more to say. And Ellie nodded. She believed it now. Because sometimes, all it takes is someone who stays. Someone who listens before the words are there. Someone like Max. Part 8. The letter? It was a Tuesday when Ellie brought the assignment home. She dropped her backpack by the door, same as always, and walked into the kitchen where Ruth was peeling apples for pie. Ruth did not look up right away. She just smiled and asked, Good day. Ellie nodded. Then she held out a folded sheet of wide-ruled notebook paper. For you, she said. Ruth dried her hands on her apron. The paper was soft and worn, folded neatly in thirds. Her name was written on the front in red crayon. Grandma Ruth. She opened it slowly. Inside, written carefully in Elias round. Earnest handwriting. Was the letter? Dear Max. It has been 23 days since you went to sleep. I counted. The tree still has your spot under it, and I sit there every day after school. Sometimes I think I see you out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn, it is just the wind. That is okay. I remember what you looked like. Your eyes were dark like coffee, and your ears were always listening. You were old. Everyone said so. But to me, you were new every day. You were the first one who did not need me to talk. You knew things. When I was scared, you would nudge my knee. When I was cold, you would sit close. When I was too quiet, you would stay anyway. The fire was loud and fast and hot. I thought I was going to disappear. But then I heard you. You did not bark. You just came. You found me in the smoke. You brought me out. People said it was brave. But I know it was love. Thank you. I am talking more now. Grandma says my voice is like wind chimes. I like that. Sometimes I still whisper your name before bed, just to say good night. If you can hear me, wag your tail. If you can tea, it is okay. I love you anyway. Love. Ellie. Ruth finished reading and let the silence settle like snow. Ellie stood beside her, head tilted, unsure. Ruth folded the letter back into its creases and held it to her chest. Then she turned and opened her arms. Ellie leaned in without hesitation. No questions. No explanations. Just two people who loved the same dog and missed him in the same quiet way. That night, Ruth lit a candle on the windowsill. Same one they always used. The one with the little paw print carved into the glass. She set Ellie's letter beside it. Didn't he say much, just whispered, "We got your mail." Into the dark. The wind picked up gently outside. Not a howl. Not a storm. Just enough to make the wind chimes tinkle once. And Ruth saw she felt a tail brush her ankle. The next morning, Ellie brought the letter to school. It was part of an assignment. Write to someone you miss. Most kids wrote to a parent, a friend, a soldier overseas, Ellie handed hers in quietly. Her teacher, Carpenter, read it at her desk, one hand over her mouth. She called Ruth that afternoon. "I hope you do not mind," she said gently, "but I shared Ellie's letter with the staff. It moved people." Ruth smiled into the phone. Max always had that effect. By the next day, the principal asked if they could post it on the school's bulletin board. Ellie agreed, as long as they added a picture. She drew one herself, under the oak tree, with a girl beside him and stars above their heads. In the bottom corner, she wrote. He heard her first word. The letter spread. Parents took pictures. The local librarian printed it out and taped it above the checkout desk. The pastor read it aloud during Sunday service. Even the mailman asked if he could make a copy. Afternoon. A stranger stopped Ruth outside the market. "You the lady with the girl who wrote that letter?" Ruth nodded slowly. The woman pressed a hand to her heart. "I lost my lab last winter. I had not cried since the funeral. But that letter," she blinked fast. "Tell your granddaughter thank you." "I will," Ruth said softly. "I promise." That evening, Ruth and Ellie walked to the oak tree together. The grass had grown long around the grave. Ellie carried a little garden rake. Ruth brought a cup of chamomile tea and a folded lawn chair. They sat side by side in the fading light. Ellie smoothed the dirt with careful hands. Then she said, "I think he knew this would happen." "Knew what?" "Honey, that I would talk." After, Ruth looked at her granddaughter, at the freckles on her cheeks, the wind-tangled hair, the way her shoulders had straightened over the past weeks. "Yes," Ruth said, "I think he did." Ellie pulled something from her jacket pocket. A dog biscuit, old, crumbling, the last one from the tin in the pantry. She placed it gently on the stone. "For later," she whispered. Before bed, Ellie took the shoebox house down from the shelf. She would added something new. A paper dog, drawn and cut with care, now sat in front of the paper house. Behind him stood two figures, her and Ruth. Above them, a tiny banner fluttered. "Thank you for staying." Ruth kissed her good night and turned off the light. Ellie's voice called out softly in the dark. "Grandma." "Yes, baby. Can we write another letter tomorrow?" "Of course," Ruth said. "Who to?" Ellie thought for a second. "Maybe to me. The me from before." Ruth felt her throat tighten. "That is a beautiful idea." Ellie smiled, and for the first time in her life, she said clearly, "Good night." Part 9. The visit. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address. Just Ruth's name handwritten in small, blocky letters. Whitaker, Clover Drive, Story City. She opened it at the kitchen table, glasses perched on her nose, sunlight streaming through the new curtains Ellie had picked out. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, polite, but it stopped her breath cold. "Dear Miss Whitaker, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. My name is James Hartley. I am a retired K-9 officer, and I worked with Max Unit 214B for 4 years at Des Moines International. I saw the news story about your granddaughter and the fire. Then I read her letter. Max was my partner. If it is not too much trouble, I would like to visit, just to say goodbye. Sincerely, Officer James Hartley Rhett. Ruth read the letter twice. Then she placed it on the counter and exhaled. Ellie, she called softly. We are going to have a visitor. He arrived the next afternoon in a dented blue pickup truck. Early 50s. Tall, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp, and a limp in his left leg. He wore a faded green army jacket and held his cap in his hands when he stepped onto the porch. Whitaker? He asked. Ruth smiled. Ruth, please. He nodded. James. They shook hands firm, warm. Familiar? The kind of shake that says, I have carried loss too. Inside, Ellie waited by the dining room table. She wore her red hoodie and a soft expression of guarded curiosity. James' eyes lit when he saw her. You must be Ellie. She nodded. I have heard a lot about you. You are braver than most grown men I have known. She smiled shyly, then pointed to the corner of the room. That was his spot. James turned slowly. His eyes rested on the flannel blanket, now folded neatly in the little reading nook. The collar sat atop it, tag still attached. He walked over and knelt beside it, ran his fingers over the leather. Same one. He whispered. Never changed a thing. They sat together over coffee. Ellie listened while the adults spoke. James told stories, airfields and parking garages, of long shifts and sudden danger. He spoke of bomb scares, false alarms, and one winter day when Max had sniffed out explosives under the bleachers before a college football game. Saved a couple hundred lives that day. James said, staring into his cup, didn't even blink. Just stopped, sat down, and looked up at me like, well, partner. What now? Ruth chuckled softly. Ellie's eyes were wide. Max never barked, she said. James looked at her, surprised. He did not, ever. He was trained that way. Quiet alert. Just the sit and stare. Ellie nodded. He did that in the fire. He just came. James smiled, but it wobbled at the edges. He always did. Just showed up when you needed him. He paused, then added, he used to sleep on the floor of my daughter's room when she was sick. We were divorced back then. I had her 1 weekend a month. Max never left her side. He looked at Ellie. She could not sleep without him. Ellie's voice was a whisper. Me neither. Later, James asked if he could see where Max was buried. They walked slowly to the oak tree. The wind stirred the grass. The sky was soft with late afternoon gold. When they reached the spot, James knelt and brushed the leaves away from the stone. 2009-2023. He heard her first word. He stared at it a long time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. A patch, frayed at the edges, black and gold. K9 Unit Me, 214B. He laid it gently beside the grave. Thought he might like that? Ellie stepped forward. Without a word, She knelt and pressed her hand to the patch, then placed her other hand over the stone. For a moment, no one spoke, and that was okay, because Max had taught them silence could hold more than sound. Back on the porch, Ruth brought out lemonade. James leaned back in the rocking chair Tom had built years ago, eyes scanning the yard like a man cataloging peace. "You did right by him," he said. Ruth looked down, her fingers twisting her napkin. "I did not know his past." "Not really. Not until the fire." James shook his head. Didn't he matter? He was never about the past. He just loved who was in front of him. He looked at Ellie. She was his mission. Ellie whispered, "He was mine." James smiled. A deep, fatherly kind of smile. The kind that said, "You are going to be okay," as the sun dipped behind the trees. James stood. "Thank you," he said, "for giving him a home." Ruth stepped forward. She said, "Thank you for raising a dog who saved my granddaughter's life." They hugged. Not long, but long enough. Then Ellie walked up to James, reached into her pocket, and handed him something. A drawing. Mac James, side by side in their uniforms. Below it, in tidy handwriting, she would written, "He never forgot you." James took it carefully, blinking hard. "Neither will I," he said. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. But just before he opened the door, he looked back one last time, at the porch, at the tree, at the girl in the red hoodie, and he saluted. That night, Ruth and Ellie sat by the window again. The candle flickered, the stars blinked awake, and the wind carried just enough sound to stir the spoons on the wind chime. Not loud, just enough to remind them Max was still here, still watching, still waiting, and in the lives he touched through fire, through silence, through one final letter, he would always stay. Part 10. The Word That Stayed. The invitation came in a manila envelope with the school logo stamped in blue ink across the front. Inside, a formal letter from the principal. "Dears Whittaker, we are honored to invite Ellie to speak at this year's S-Story City Elementary Fall Assembly. The theme is Voices That Matter. Her story and Max has touched many. If she is willing, we would be proud to have her share a few words." Ruth read the letter twice. Then she placed it on the counter and turned to Ellie, who was coloring at the table, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in concentration. "Sweetheart," Ruth said gently, "they would like you to speak." Ellie looked up, her pencil stilled. "Out loud?" she asked. Ruth nodded. "Only if you want to." Ellie did not answer. Not right away. She just stared out the window where the oak tree stood, golden leaves falling like blessings across the grass. Then she said, clear and steady, "I think Max would want me to." They practiced for a week. Every evening after dinner, Ellie would stand in front of the living room, holding a folded sheet of paper in both hands. She would whisper the first few lines, stumble on a word, then start again. Ruth never corrected. She just sat on the couch, hands folded in her lap, Smiling through tears, she tried to blink away. By Wednesday, Ellie read the whole thing without stopping. By Friday, she looked Ruth in the eye when she said the final line. He heard me before anyone else did. The auditorium smelled like crayons, floor polish, and nervous energy. Ruth sat in the third row, a program folded neatly in her lap. Her heart pounded louder than the overhead speakers. When Ellie's name was called, a hush fell over the room. She stepped onto the stage in her red hoodie, hair pulled back with a ribbon Ruth had saved from a Christmas gift 2 years earlier. The microphone loomed tall. A teacher bent it gently toward her. Ellie unfolded her paper, took a breath, then began. Her voice was not loud, but it did not need to be. It carried, not just through the room, but through every person in it. She spoke of silence, of losing her mother, of moving to a house that did not feel like home. She spoke of Ruth, of quiet breakfasts, of sitting on the porch with nothing but wind. Then she spoke of Max, how he did not ask her to talk, how he sat with her through nightmares, how he went into the fire without being asked, and how, in the middle of the smoke, when everything burned and the world turned black, she found her voice. One word. His name. She paused then. The whole room held its breath. I thought I was too broken to speak. She said, but Max showed me that love listens even when you can't talk. Then she looked up. I talk now, not because someone told me to, but because someone waited. The auditorium erupted in applause. But Ellie did not smile until she stepped off the stage and ran into Ruth's arms. Did it? She whispered. Ruth kissed her forehead. Baby. She said, you lived it. That evening, they walked to the oak tree. Ruth carried a small wooden box. Ellie carried a letter. Inside the box was Max's tag. The K9 patch officer Hartley had left, and the crayon drawing Ellie had made of the lighthouse keeper. Ruth placed the box at the base of the stone. Ellie tucked the letter under it. I told them everything. She whispered, but this part is just for you. They stood there a while, wind in their hair, hands clasped, hearts wide open. Then Ruth reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something Ellie had not seen in a long time. A small, black clicker, the kind Max used to respond to during training. She clicked it once. Just once. A sound as soft as breath, but enough to stir the wind, enough to send a swirl of golden leaves dancing around their ankles. That night, Ellie placed her folded speech on the shelf above her bed. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the house, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl. Then she whispered into the dark. The word did not tremble this time. It glowed. It stayed, and in the quiet that followed, she felt it. A presence. Not loud, not near, but always there, because some names are not just sounds. They are anchors, promises, homes, and when spoken from the heart, they never really leave. End of Part 10, final chapter. Thank you for walking this journey with Max, Ellie, and Ruth, a story of silence, love, and the kind of loyalty that waits as long as it takes.